after a hijacked jetliner slammed into the southwest wall of the Pentagon, causing part of the building
sophisticated and incredibly deadly attack on
America,
beginning
for so many people watching these pictures, it's very hard to believe or to know what is safe.
September 11, 2001 is a day that changed countless lives, and it's one that will remain in the world's psyche for a long time to come. Joel Rosenberg's life was also changed that day, but not in the way you might expect.
And I was trying to finish up this novel, a novel that opens in the first page by putting you inside the cockpit of a jet plane hijacked by radical Islamic terrorists coming in on a kamikaze attack mission into an American city. And then it leads to a war with Saddam Hussein over terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Suddenly the door bursts open, and Lynn has just come home, and she has heard about the attacks in New York on the radio on the way home from school. She's like, "You're not going to believe what's happening." And we turn on television, and not that long after that, we saw the two towers begin to collapse. It really wasn't until a couple months later that I began to, it began to dawn on me, yeah, you'll never be able to sell that novel, because nobody is going to publish a book that begins with a kamikaze attack. What are you going to send it to a New York-based publisher? It ain't going to happen. 9:05.
The fiction novel had been the beginning of a new career for Joel, who had spent the last 11 years as a political consultant for leaders in the U.S. and Israel.
Oh, I helped them all lose. So I didn't mean to, but the truth is I'm a failed political consultant. I helped Steve Forbes lose 2 presidential campaigns. I was hired by Benjamin Netanyahu for his comeback to become the next Prime Minister of Israel. It's been 7 years he hasn't been the Prime Minister of Israel. So I didn't really have a great track record.
It was a low point in Joel's life. He had been living off savings to get the book written, and now he wasn't sure what to do next.
I got, that's 9 months of my life wasted, and another failed project. And I thought, well, but as I prayed about it, I thought, Lord, I know you got bigger fish to fry. You got a war going on. The whole world is going to war, and this doesn't really suffice, merit much of your attention. But when you get a moment, if you could just sort of put something in my inbox that says, here's what I want you to do with the rest of your life, because right now I'm really quite lost.
These regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
4 months later, Joel was watching the State of the Union address with his wife when President Bush said something that was also straight out of his book.
And the next great threat we may have to face as a nation, as the world, is the threat of Saddam Hussein, his linkage to terrorism, and his previous use of weapons of mass destruction. And we might have to go to war with this guy. And, Lynn and I looked at each other as though we were sitting in an episode of The Twilight Zone. Joel Rosenberg? So then my agent called me the next day and said, do you work for the CIA? And I said, no. And he said, sure, well, that's what you'd have to say if you did work for the CIA and you just couldn't tell me, I said, well, I think the dynamic has just changed.
His book was released November 2002. The war with Iraq started 4 months later.
No one had ever heard of Joel Rosenberg. No one had ever heard of this novel. And suddenly it was #1 on Amazon.com, 11 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. I was on 160 TV and radio and shows and other interviews in less than 60 days.
The Last Jihad was the first book Joel had ever written.
I'd never taken a class on writing a novel. In Washington, I didn't even have time to read novels, maybe one a year. So the idea of writing a political thriller that would become a New York Times bestseller was almost ludicrous, except that it seemed to work.
His publisher wanted more. Joel agreed to write another book, but with the stipulation that he couldn't promise the same startling coincidences of the first.
So the second book opens with the death of Yasser Arafat and an American president pushing for peace and democracy in a post-Arafat world in the Middle East. 13 months after the book was released, Arafat was dead. 2 months after that, President Bush decided to make democracy in the Middle East the centerpiece of his second-term agenda. The strangest thing maybe of all of that book was that the first couple pages put you inside a U.S. diplomatic convoy driving into Gaza as part of the peace process, when it's suddenly attacked by a massive explosion. 6 days before the last days hit bookstores, in October of 2003, a U.S. diplomatic convoy driving into Gaza as part of the peace process was attacked by terrorists.
With predictions in his second book coming true, U.S. News and World Report magazine dubbed Rosenberg a modern-day Nostradamus.
So now I'm on hundreds of radio and TV shows saying, I'm not Nostradamus, I'm not a psychic, I'm not a clairvoyant, I'm an evangelical Christian from an Orthodox Jewish heritage, and I'm basing these novels on a series of geopolitical scenarios that I think, and they'd say, these hosts would say, what did you just say? Did you just say you're Jewish and you believe in Jesus? Yes, I'd say, and I'm basing these novels on a series of geopolitical scenarios. Yeah, that's all fascinating, but how can you be Jewish and believe in Jesus? And we were back to the races, and I had a chance to talk about my faith with 15 million people that fall.
Rosenberg continued writing the series and released The Ezekiel Option, which talks about a military alliance between a dictator in Russia and an Iranian state trying to build nuclear weapons. Sound familiar?
And a fictional Islamic leader in the book says, we're going to wipe Israel off the map. 5 months after The Ezekiel Option was published, the president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, said, we're going to wipe Israel off the map. And the phone started ringing again, going, how did you know? Well, I didn't really know. But you have to understand, Ahmadinejad wasn't the president of Iran when I wrote The Ezekiel Option. That's why, radio hosts would say, look, your first book, all right, that was uncanny. The second one got a little eerie. Now you're completely creeping me out, man. People would say, don't write about me if you're going to write these novels, because, these things seem to come true.
So how does Rosenberg explain his unnerving ability to write fiction that comes true?
Well, I've been basing these novels on a series of Bible prophecies. But, Arafat's never mentioned in the Bible. Suicide bombers, never mentioned. Saddam Hussein, kamikaze pilots, never mentioned. So what I was doing was taking the prophecies that we know and trying to back them up and say, all right, how would we get from where we were then, geopolitically in real time, in real history, how would we get from that point to these prophecies?
Rosenberg released Book 4 in the series, and the final installment, Dead Heat, is slated for release March 2008. He's also written Epicenter, a nonfiction book detailing 10 news headlines he thinks you might see in your lifetime. But he says there's really only one message he's trying to get across in all of his endeavors.
And one of the themes in my novels, as well as my nonfiction book, Epicenter, is that to misunderstand the nature and threat of evil is to risk being blindsided by it. And the West was largely blindsided by Pearl Harbor in 1941. We were blindsided by Auschwitz and Dachau and the Holocaust in World War II. People were stunned and blindsided by September 11th. But now new dangers are arising, and the weapons that these guys, some of them have available to them or that they're trying to pursue, are really doomsday type weapons. Iran is preparing for a war against Israel. Syria is preparing for a war against Israel. Hezbollah, the terrorist group in Lebanon, preparing for a war in Israel. Israel is preparing for a war against them. The United States is preparing for the war. Everybody in the region is preparing for war. And it's going to happen. Could happen in the next few days, next few weeks, next few months, years. I don't know when, but I feel, my wife and I feel, we've got to do everything we can to get ready.
Rosenberg is taking his message to the world through numerous radio and television interviews, including CNN, ABC, MSNBC, Fox News, and others. But as he looks back on the crazy circumstances that brought him here, he says one of the biggest changes in his life has been on the inside.
I asked God, would you use my life somehow? These are my loaves and fishes. All I have is a writing, I wouldn't even call it a skill. I write things that people don't read and respond to. Could you use that? Could you break it? Could you bless it? Could you feed people with it, just as you blessed the loaves and fishes that the disciples brought to Jesus? And I never expected him to say yes. I'm ashamed to say that. But I didn't really expect him to say yes. I wanted him to. I wasn't sure he would. And I certainly didn't expect this many people to be listening or interested in what I'm doing and my perspective, and more importantly, the perspective of the Scriptures. I just didn't see that coming.
So what's next for Joel? Despite his amazing success at predicting global events, he says he has no idea. But after all that's happened, he's ready for anything. For 100 Huntley Street, I'm Cheryl Weber.